It can help you understand why religious rituals exist, because it's worship ultimately. So a better way to say what I said in terms of attention, you could say the way in which we bind together is something like veneration, celebration, and ultimately worship. The thing you worship will be the highest thing which binds you to a group. It will be the common attention you place together to recognize each other as being part of something will be worship.
I'm Paul, founder of Maniphesto. Core is our online mastermind network, and this video is recorded live during our weekly community meeting. If you like it, then subscribe and check out our website if you'd like to join the next community meeting held every Friday. Welcome, guys. Good to have you on board for another Friday meeting. And very big welcome to Jonathan to join us here today. He was at the European Men's Gathering with us, as most of you know, this summer. And this is the first time he's joining our core meeting. But Jonathan's been a massive, massive influence for me for a long time. I normally introduce Jonathan as saying he's the spirit at the roots, or the symbolic world, which Jonathan is running, is like the spirit at the roots of the whole Jordan Peterson movement somehow, or at the heart of it. That's what I normally expect. I don't know if you've heard that one before, Jonathan.
Well, that's very kind. I would probably not agree, but thank you.
Good. So we're going to talk about community and community leadership today. And I think, Jonathan, maybe I'll just ask you to introduce those terms for people who are not familiar with your thinking. What does it mean when we say community? And maybe we can also go a little bit into like what's happening to community in our society in the West today as well.
And so maybe the best way to understand community is to understand it as an analogy of you as a person, you know. And the way that I talk about reality is that there's just a basic pattern, and the basic pattern is really something like the relationship between unity and multiplicity, right? How things can have many things and then just also be one. And so there's a manner in which you as a person, you have all these aspects to you. You know, and you can feel it inside you. You know, you have different thoughts, you have different feelings. Sometimes those feelings get along, sometimes they don't. You know, you find yourself desiring two opposite things at the same time, or you find yourself thinking things that contradict each other. And you have these little sub-personalities which coexist inside you. And so there's a manner in which all that multiplicity comes together so that you can recognize yourself, right? Where you can look yourself in the mirror and you can recognize, oh, that's me. You can recognize that there's a connection between the different things that you do in your life, that those connect you in a person. And so that reality of you being a lot of stuff and then coming into one is something which also exists at higher levels of human engagement. And so there's a manner in which there's a difference between, for example, a crowd and a community. So a crowd is a bunch of people too. But those people are not aligned. They're not moving in the same direction, or they're not looking in the same direction or attending to the same things. And what makes a community is exactly that. What makes a community is a bunch of people that are together for a reason. And that reason is important. Because one of the things that's happened, let's say, in the modern world is that we've tended to ignore the idea that there's a reason why we exist together. So you can think of it as the modern city where everybody just kind of lives next to each other. And we have all these people living, in houses next to each other, not knowing each other, not having common goals, not having common direction. And it creates a sense of fragmentation and nihilism and loneliness. And so to understand that communities are groups of people that exist together for a purpose, for a reason. And sometimes that reason can be active, you know, like a team, let's say a sports team or a political movement or something like that. But sometimes it can also be something that connects you together in terms of just identity. And so a common history, a common memory, you know, a common attention is a way to maybe bind all those things together. There's something that binds us together in terms of what we're attending to. We're all looking in the same direction, And so by doing that, we recognize that we're together. And so that's true, of course, in terms of a family, but that also becomes true, right, in terms of, again, in terms of a sports team. If a sports team isn't all looking in the same direction, then that sports team is not going to be a very good sports team. They're going to lose. They're going to fight. They're going to be in conflict. And so it's important to understand that, like I said, there's an analogy between you as a person and then those higher beings, you could say, those higher group of people. And there's a manner in which we're made to be aligned at all the different levels. And so if you are not aligned in yourself, then you will not be a good member of a community, right? And it's very simple, right? If you have all these different tendencies that are fighting inside your soul, and then you try to join a group, then you will be toxic, right, to that group. And everybody's experienced that either in themselves or in others, where they're like, this person keeps contradicting themselves. They're happy, and all of a sudden they become angry, and we don't know why. And they're bringing all their problems into the group, or whatever it is they're doing. Because they're not aligned, then they can't participate very well into the higher community. But there's another way in which that happens also top down, which is that if you have a coherent community, a community that holds well together, it can actually have a healing quality on the people that are in it. And so if you have a family that has a nice level of cohesion, that has a good sense of unity and a good sense of being together, if one of the members of that family has a tendency to be to break down for whatever reason they're breaking down, then the unity of that community will, let's say, compensate or heal or be able to realign the person to a certain extent that is breaking down. And so it becomes inevitable in that way of understanding that if we break down all as individuals, it will break down our society. But the other way is true, is that if the bonds of our society break down and we become anonymous little dots on the map that don't connect with each other, then people themselves will start to fragment and to start to have mental illness, and will start to have all these issues that we see in the world today, that there's a direct connection between the two. And so what I'm proposing is really a kind of re-engagement in the world at different levels. And the way that, for example, the state is trying to compensate for that is not necessarily the right way in terms of a human. And so to have services, the idea that you have like services for people, that's not the same as a community. It's not the same to have a social worker or a psychologist that treats you individually, rather than have bonds in a community that bind you together towards higher purposes. And so we have to be attentive to that, because we tend to not notice.
I think Jonathan just muted.
Sorry. I just wanted to tell my family to be careful with the noise. And so anyway, so that's maybe a good way to kind of understand community, and not understand it, but also understand why it's important. Why it's important that we engage and we understand what that's for.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you like this dynamic of the kind of from the bottom up, but also from the top down, seeing things in this interchange in up and down in a hierarchy somehow. Because so Maniphesto is an organization where we organize a network of men's groups, especially, and the leaders of those men's groups meet once a week, and we talk every Thursday, and we actually check in that meeting with saying like, hey, we have a group called Timbuktu, and we have a group called Jerusalem or whatever, right? And we actually introduce as our group, and sometimes we've even experimented with like, seeing that group as a body with all the different functions of it as well, right? But then each group, of course, also has its parts, and each member of each group also has their parts. And then Maniphesto as an organization is also part of, a greater community of organizations that are doing this kind of work, right? And so since I've encountered your work, Jonathan, then I've really become much more aware of how are we integrating into the system that we're a part of and that we're dependent of as well, and becoming aware of that somehow, right? And yeah.
But I think that the way that you're structuring it, the idea of having a kind of one overarching group, let's say, but then also having subgroups, is really the best way to deal with everything, because there's a manner in which larger communities play a function, but there's some functions that the larger communities can't play. And this is, of course, again, the problem of the modern state, which is that the modern state can't attend to you personally. And it's the same even for any kind of big group. But let's say a group of 10 people or a group of 5, 6, 7 people that come together, then that group is at a size where each person can know each other very well, and they can also work together in a direct way, so that then that can scale back up into the higher group. And so when that little group joins with the bigger group, then everybody's kind of aligned with what it is we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing. And so it's a good way to do anything, like to run a business, to run any kind of organization, is to have this fractal structure of groups and subgroups, let's say.
Yeah.
You see that like in the Bible, you find this amazing description of when Moses is out in the desert, with the Israelites, and the Israelites are all coming to Moses with their problems. So it's like, 100,000 people like coming to Moses and saying, I have a problem with this, and I have a problem with that person and that person. And of course that can't work, right? And it just can't hold. And so what Moses does is he sets up this fractal hierarchy where there are people responsible for 1,000, people responsible for 100, people responsible for 10. And so it's like from 1,000, 100 to 10, then those people all work together, the 10 together, and then let's say are dependent of one that's responsible for 100. So it's basically like a military hierarchy, but that's really the best way for any organization to function.
Yeah, and so if we're going to talk a little bit about community leadership, then there's an idea. I think I got actually first time from, is that your brother's book, right there?
Yeah,
that
the language of creation
in the bookshelf. There's this idea of kind of like holding a hierarchy in a way that includes the diversity of all the constituent parts, but doesn't destroy any of the uniqueness of them as well. And because a lot of the time when people think about authority and power being exercised or whatever, then this idea of like tyrannical power, right? So
yeah, definitely. And I think that it's important to kind of understand that too. Well, there's a few things that are important to understand. One is that most groups, let's say, are not absolute. They're not meant to cover your entire being. And that's super important. Super important because we're seeing we've seen in tyrannical states, we see the desire to create absolute identities that cover your entire being. But in reality, that's not how it works. And so it's like you have, let's say you're in a group, and that group will integrate you towards its purpose, right? So let's say Maniphesto, you have Maniphesto, you're integrated in Maniphesto because you want to do men's work, you want to do your own work on yourself, you want to find discipline or whatever it is that you're getting from Maniphesto, right? Then Maniphesto will join you together towards that goal. But you also have other stuff about you, or you have other interests, you have other things that connect you to other groups, or sometimes don't connect you to any group at all, right? Idiosyncrasies. We all have an aspect of us that's a little weird, that's a little monstrous, that's a little idiosyncratic. And then there's a way in which normal hierarchies are meant to kind of join us together, and then also understand that every aspect that's joined together has some idiosyncrasy that we can't integrate, but that's also fine. As long as that idiosyncrasy doesn't try to manifest itself too strongly, doesn't make too much noise, then you can just leave it alone. But of course, if someone in Maniphesto was like obsessed with some political ideology, let's say, which isn't connected to Maniphesto, it's like, I'm sure in Maniphesto, everybody can have their political opinions, and that's fine. But if someone tried to force that into Maniphesto, let's say, someone in the group was saying like, just that's all they were talking about all the time in all the groups. And when the little groups would meet with the big groups, that's all they would try to talk about. At some point, you would have to discipline that person, or you would have to eject them, because they're trying to bring an idiosyncrasy into the group in a manner that's actually going to destroy the group. And paying attention to that is very important right now, because there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of that type of trying to bring in other goals into groups in order to that can destabilize them,
Yeah. Well, I guess what I've been thinking about before this conversation is the need for knowing like what's at the center of your group. What is the thing that you're orientating towards? I think especially COVID has accelerated this tendency for having role models, which we know from their YouTube account or from their Instagram accounts, and then we look up to and we idolize these people, right? And think like, oh, that's the guy I want to be like, or something like that. But sometimes, and this is where I think you often talk about, like, the need for granular community and the multiple levels of embedded community as such, because when our highest point is too far away, then we have a tendency, obviously a social media profile isn't a person.
No,
what you really want to be orientating towards is that unique paradoxical complexity, which is a human being, right?
Yeah, well, that's
I just
why
got called a fanboy on the chat here when I pointed out the book, which is kind of funny, and that's probably true to a certain extent, Joachim. So thanks for that. But I also think it's really important that Jonathan actually came to the European Men's Gathering this year, and we got to know him, right? And I saw him participating in the exercises.
Suffering. You saw me suffer is what you saw.
And his muscles aching the next day from having yeah.
But you're right. That's one of the reasons why, like, I always tell people, I say go to church, right? That's what I tell people. But when I say go to church, what I mean, it's a shorthand way of saying, like, get off the internet to a certain extent. Like, you also need to connect to real communities in the flesh, because there's a way in which this screen, it's exactly that. It's a screen. And so I can control my image, and I can control what I'm projecting, and I can make myself into something. But whereas when you're in an actual community with people, everything is a lot messier, and it makes us more patient and more accepting, because it's like you realize that everybody has a messy part. Like, everybody has something about them that's weird. And so you kind of have to realize that and not see it as, so like cancel culture, is easy on the internet, because it's all distance and it's all images and it's all, but when you're standing in front of someone that sneezes, that has like all the human frailty and all the human idiosyncrasies, then all of a sudden we hope that there's a tendency to be more understanding and to be able to to actually be more connected to real power, real authority, real leadership, but also real weakness and real frailness and real lack of people who don't live up to their word or don't live up to their ideal themselves.
Now, there's a way in which could I call it the neurosis of needing purity, or the obsession with purity that's around right now, very much what we've seen in the pandemic as well, is kind of fueled by an online world where we can have these digital boundaries of on and off, right? So everything becomes even just like discussion. I found on Zoom, like, you can't have the same kind of disagreements on Zoom, because you can't have the multiple voices at the same time that you could have in a real life discussion as well, right? So things have to become cleaner and more clear cut somehow, right? And so
and also
engaging in real in-person
like,
community.
Even the frame of a Zoom discussion, in a real life world, you're sitting at a meal, you're sitting in a living room, and then you argue, but then there are pauses, and then someone walks up and walks away a little bit, comes back. So there's just a reality, like a more organic reality of human relationship, for sure. So yeah.
Yeah. So I maybe, the way I see it is like, we have to embrace online, but we have to be very, very careful that we don't become overly dependent on it. We normally get technologies too quickly and they wash in over us, and we don't understand the full consequences of it. Out here where I live on the countryside, then there's so many houses, like beautiful, beautiful old thatched houses that are built right up on the road. And that's because they put the roads there when there was still just horses and carriages, right? And now these people have these big trucks driving right past their front doors every single day. And these beautiful old houses, just have collapsed in value. So it's like, if we didn't know what was going to happen when we invented the cars, about what would be happening. So
yeah, we didn't realize the effect. For sure, cars have been one of the most destabilizing technologies ever created, because they permitted people to be in contact with those that are far away, and also permitted to create neighborhoods, let's say commercial places that are 30-minute drive away from your house. At least in Canada here, you have stores that are 20 minutes, 30-minute drive away from your house. And so you have these places where people live, and then you have these places where people shop, and then, and so there isn't this kind of normal, let's say, village or city structure where you have a church in the center, a place where everybody kind of goes once a week to meet, to be together, to express their attention in the same direction. And then you have markets and you have different things that flow from that, so that you always know why you exist together. You always remember it every day when the church bells ring. The church bell rings, or every year when there's a festival to celebrate this or that, or there's a statue which goes up for someone that's related to your own story. You have this sense of like, okay, this is us, or this is something this is why we're together. But in the modern world and in the digital world especially, there really is this leveling where there isn't much of that, and people are trying to recreate totems and recreate points of cohesion, but it's a little frightening. A lot of it is, let's say, it seems a little unbalanced. Like all the woke culture seems to be wanting to do that. It's like we have something that binds us, right? This ideal, this political ideal that we're aiming for. But it's because it's online, and because you can scream all kinds of epithets at anybody, you can do things to people online that you would never dare if you stood in front of them. It's creating more disjunction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and Maniphesto is an example of that, right? It's an attempt, or it's at least an example of the attempt to create a point of verticality somehow in a very flat landscape. Yeah. Or sometimes I think I like the idea of like an arc or something like that, with this flood of chaos that's washing over us as well, right?
And I think what you're doing is like almost like a counterweight to the more kind of vacuous, anonymous internet part, where you have Twitter and all these, and YouTube with all these anonymous comments and all this kind of this hatred. It seems like you're using the digital space to actually try to reconnect people together, which is great, especially if people are alone and people are struggling to find are surrounded by, I mean, it's true that there's often, you get the sense that you're surrounded by zombies, or you're surrounded by people that don't care, that don't want something more. And so I think it's even if it's online, I think
it's not so much the people that are around you, it's the platform that you're on. So the majority of the platforms that we spend the majority of our time on, they're free in the sense that you don't have to pay to use them, but you're the product. And the purpose of these platforms is to turn you into a atomized consumer or chaser of pleasure or something like that. Like they're appealing to your passions, to engage you and to hold your attention, or to get your money from you, right? And
yeah,
so
it's all about attention, and I think that, but it's good. It's interesting. One of the things the platforms are doing, I think, and where the situation is doing, is to help us understand the role of attention. And in community, the role of attention is very important. And it can help us understand what community is if we understand the idea of attention. And it can also help us understand things which are difficult for people to understand today. For example, why we have certain types of social or religious rituals, why we have celebrations, because why do we celebrate things? Like, what is that? Why do we have festivals and celebrations? And it has to do with attention, because that is one of the things which actually binds the community together, is as simple as common attention. So if you want to manifest unity in your family, the best way to do that is to celebrate Christmas, or celebrate birthdays, or celebrate things which remind you why you exist together. And that tendency to celebrate has been reduced quite a bit in the last decades, almost as if people think it's some kind of superstition, or it's corny to celebrate things. We rather be cynical and aloof than celebratory. But celebration is the main way in which we are bound together. So think of it again like as a soccer team or a sports team. You know that the amount to which the team and the fans will celebrate the team will be a huge factor in whether or not the team coheres, whether or not the team actually wins, and whether or not people will watch the care about the team. Like, if no one cares and no one celebrates, then they'll be playing on a field alone for themselves, which is not nothing, but it's not much. And that ultimately scales up to religious rituals. It can help you understand why religious rituals exist, because it's worship ultimately. So a better way to say what I said in terms of attention, you could say the way in which we bind together is something like veneration, celebration, and ultimately worship. The thing you worship will be the highest thing which binds you to a group. It will be the common attention you place together to recognize each other as being part of something will be worship.
Yeah. That's a really deep idea. Like the function, what I get is like the function of community is to nudge people in directing attention towards a specific thing. And what that is will form and shape the community then, basically, because there's so many things to put our attention on, right?
Exactly. And you can see that, our world is made of distraction. And so that the fact that our world is made of distractions is also, you could say, is one of the reasons why we feel lonely. It's like one of the reasons why, I tried to explain to you why it scales at different levels. And so, let's say the kind of practice of mindfulness, it's interesting because that's what it's about. It's trying to cohere you by being mindful, just by being attentive. That's all you need to do. That's what they're saying. All you need to do is be attentive, and that attention will actually bind you in a better manner together. Yeah. But there's a way in which that type of mindfulness scales up into communities. That is, if we are mindful, if we're attentive to the center of what binds us together, then that will also bind us together as higher communities.
Yeah. So in Maniphesto, we don't have any one thing at the middle. We've had to agree because we're explicitly not a Christian platform. But the kind of operating system that we have here in this online group Maniphesto core is we call it the 3 Ps. And so the 3 Ps are practice, people, and purpose. And so each man has to identify like, okay, well, how am I going to move forward in my life as far as like a practice is concerned? And that's something that I do regularly. That's kind of focusing my attention on how I'm molding and forming myself. And then people is my, the relationships that I'm involved in with other people. And then last of all, the idea of purpose is this kind of, that's the masculine verticality of like looking up for a vision for myself. Like, what is it that I'm actually trying to do?
Yeah, but I think that beyond those P's, there's something more that binds you together, and it has to do with something like a reappropriation of masculinity in general, right? And so I think that that's even higher than what you said, which is saying like there's something wrong with masculinity. There's something about it that's off, and maybe we don't even know what that is. Maybe we don't totally understand what's going on. But we do have this intuition that there's something off about the way we're living masculinity, the way masculinity is being presented to us, the way that it's being understood in media and in society today. And so we want to gather around the notion of masculinity and try to make it alive, try to make it live, like venerate masculinity to a certain extent in order to make it more living.
Which doesn't mean worship that masculinity, right?
No, of course not.
You can also turn masculinity on an icon.
I hope you wouldn't
right?
worship masculinity because especially something like masculinity, which needs the feminine in order to even exist. So you have to be careful. Yeah. It's like, that's why God is one and not two. It's like you have to be careful. Like things like masculinity, for example, exist in relationship to the feminine. And so you always have to but there is a sense in which you could gather around something. And let's say circumambulate,
veneration,
right? Turn around, attend to it, try to understand it, try to engage with it in ways that will then form you, and then will also bind you to each other, And so the idea of any kind of band of brothers or any kind of group of men that create a deep affection with each other. There's something about that which I think Maniphesto is trying to create, and even more than like the kind of anyway. That's my vision, but I might be off too.
No, I at the core of it is a band of brothers that are there, supportive but also challenging and lifting. Instead of like there can be competition, but healthy competition helps us to give our best. It's also part of the masculinity. We can't like deny the warrior or the chat, the kind of those aspects of what we are. But but we need to. So maybe, what is masculine and feminine? Let's go right to the heart of that one. Are you up for that? Like, what does that mean? Like, what do these words mean? You know, everyone says like, oh yeah, well, you know, everyone has a masculine and feminine side. Da, da, da. But what is a good way to think about masculine and feminine for you? Like, how should we relate to those terms?
So, I mean, I think the best way to understand it is really, this is going to be very, very, I'm going to bring it down to the very, very basic as I can bring it so that you can understand. And understand, first of all, that it's important to, like Paul said, to understand that even if you are a man, you are not only a man, you are a person. And as a person, there's other aspects of you besides being a man. But to the extent that you are masculine, that also has a certain reality. And you can understand it in the reason why masculine and feminine exist. Masculine and feminine exist in the human species for the propagation of the human race. That's what it exists for. So if you look at how that works, you can understand it. And so the feminine is the home. The feminine is that which gives body, right? Which provides body for the child. And so it provides matter. That's what it does. Like, it literally does that. It gives matter. And then it gives body, you know, and it creates a protective shield around the child, right? It creates it's a womb. That's what the feminine is. And the man gives seed. And that seed, he also gives protection, and he gives direction. And that seed, let's say the seed scales up in terms of its meaning. And so just like the idea that the feminine gives the matter, literally gives matter to the child, right? Then more metaphorically or more socially, women tend to be related to the home, and related to food, and related to the idea of care, and the idea of enveloping and surrounding, right? And creating that private space, that space of togetherness, right? Whereas the masculine tends, just like physically, gives just seed, and then backs off, right? And then the body, everything kind of in the same way, then the masculine tends to be associated with something like authority, and something like direction, and something like leadership. And so that's really maybe the best way to understand it. But it's a universal opposite, right? It's heaven and earth. It's yin and yang. It's something which describes the very kind of basic structure of how reality works. And so a lot of people are scared of that, because they're like, oh no, again, like it's so contradictory to the modern way of thinking. But we have to understand that whether or not you identify masculine and feminine directly to men and women, you're gonna need those two aspects in the world. You're gonna need them, because you need both this kind of public authority, leadership type world, and you also need the other aspect. And so even in like a male relationships, you'll find that set itself up, where you have a leader and his band, and the band will actually play a more feminine role in relationship to the leader. And men are willing to accept that to the extent that that's the role they're playing in a hierarchy. But it doesn't mean, it's like I said, to the extent that you're a man, and then in that relationship to the feminine, that's the let's say that's the role that you can play, or I think the role that you can play that is the most satisfying for you and for others as well.
Mm-hmm. I think in Mathieu's book, doesn't it say something about, like, you know, everything's in these nested hierarchies, and you're masculine to that which is below you, and you're feminine to that which is above you, right? And so you're receptive to that which is above, and you're imparting down. And then the masculine also eats from that which is below. As you said, the feminine provides the body, provides the matter. So you're eating, food. You're sustained by that, but then you have to provide
protection, authority, direction, all of that stuff, and name, like identity, all of that comes from above. Like you said, I mean, it is really like it really is a fractal relationship. And so as Christian, for example, like I can say something like, I am the bride of Christ, and it's totally fine. There's nothing weird about that. It doesn't, because it's at another level, right? It's not at the level that I actually have a sexual organ and that I'm engaging with a woman. It's at another level. It's playing on the same relationship, but that's at a different level that doesn't, that in that level in which then I become feminine for that which is above me. And it's the same, like, let's say, like you can see that, like, in a lot of cultures, you'll have the same, like, I don't know if like in rap culture, for example, they use the word shorty to talk about women, but also talk about their crew, like their younger guys that are hanging around them. And people can engage in those analogies by understanding that it's not a physically sexual relationship between the one above and below, but it has an analogy related to that, to the level in which the person below is taking instruction, is modeling, on the higher person, and that's completely fine. It's not weird at all.
Yeah, I think these are such fundamental terms that just bear repeating and understanding at a deeper level, even the simple things. So I think
it's really important. It's the understanding that's super important, because the modern world has a tendency to level, let's say, then what happens is that the normal tendency to understand masculine and feminine at different levels of reality are leveled to one, which is I have a penis and I have this sexual energy becomes just physical. So because of that, everything becomes literally sexualized. And people struggle to understand, let's say, the possibility of playing these different roles without having to bring it back down to that very basic biological urge. And so it creates a lot of confusion in people, because someone who might feel admiration towards a man that is something they look up to, if they live in that perfectly level world, they can easily confuse that admiration for something which is just biological and desire. And the same going up and down. And so I think that understanding that all these things are in nested hierarchies can help us to make sense of, even as men, of our own feelings and of our own aspirations, and of our own, the way we perceive other men and how we perceive ourselves in different hierarchies.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things I'd like to dive into now, but I want to give some time for the guys in the community to ask some questions as well. So I'm going to have one more thing. Maybe at the end, I'll go into another thing as well. But one of the things that I've looked into a lot, and what I see as the most powerful force that kind of creates this yearning drive towards the hierarchy, or up the hierarchy as well, but also is involved in sexuality, is Eros, which is this maybe the most powerful force in humankind. And so maybe, can you relate that to masculine, feminine? And what I see is Eros is, really a force that gets misused, but ultimately is the drive towards God.
Yeah, of course. I mean, at least in the Christian understanding, the Eros, you can understand Eros as basically just the drive to move towards things. Like, that's really the best way to understand it. It's like, if you have a drive to move towards something, that's what Eros is. And so the ultimate version of that, because it's also something which, the drive to move towards something, which ultimately can be fruitful as well. And that's why. Does
it mean also to become one with? I would even gone further and said not just move towards, but become one with.
Well, to be joined with, definitely.
To be joined
with,
yeah.
I mean, to be joined with the thing that you're, let's say, being pulled towards. But there's a manner in which that word has become also very leveled. It has been now being attributed only to biological engagement, or like just let's say strictly sexual relationships between people. But there's a manner in which, if you understand that Eros is a wider category, then you actually find yourself in a position where you can identify that energy inside you, and you can also direct it, and you can be more conscious of how you direct that energy. And then it does actually somehow have to do with, it does in a way have to do with sexual energy. You know, there's in old manuals for salespeople, let's say like car salesmen, they would say something like, if you're going to go for a big sale, right, don't have sex the day before. And it's like something that people that would struggle to say that today, like it's just weird, but it's not weird at all, because you have drive in you, you have energy, and you have drive towards things. And so if you're not careful how you use that drive or how you spend it, you know, you spend that energy, then you'll find yourself, you know, in funny predicaments where you won't realize even why you're able to do something or not able to do something, you know. And so I think that if we can re-understand Eros as this drive towards things, then we can actually find ways to discipline ourselves in order to actually increase Eros towards things that are valuable and that are useful. And ultimately, that is what, you know, like Paul said, at least in the not just in the Christian vision, but even in the Platonic vision or in many religious visions, that ultimately that drive is there to kind of bring you up, to move you up towards the highest, and to unite you to God ultimately.
Yeah. Okay. So guys, hands up if you have a question. Let's see. And I think we'll take one question from the crowd before we stop the recording and go into a more private discussion with, we'll have a last bits for, but yeah, let's hear first. Bolo, let's start with you.
I have a question. I think that you guys said, don't worship masculinity. Did you say so?
Yeah, I did say that. Yeah.
Yeah. And but also you said that in relationship to God, we play the feminine role and the God is the masculine. And we also worship God, obviously, and God is also a he, right? So how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, well, God is not a he, and I think that's a very, very traditional position to say. God is, of course, beyond all definition and all identity. But then God does present himself to us as Father. And so, but we worship him as God. But it's not, how can I say this? We also understand that God is not a man, right? God presents, because masculinity has to do with manifestation, you could say, then it's not weird, it's not strange that God would appear as masculine. And that something like the secret aspect of God, or that the unsaid or secret, unsayable aspect of God would look more feminine, you could say, but that we don't talk about that. But that the aspect of God that we encounter is the Father, because the Father appears above us, right? The Father appears above us, like your Father appears above you as your leader, as your authority, right? And so we say God is a king, we say God is a Father, we say God is all these things, but obviously we understand that God is more than that, for sure. And so I would say I understand the question, but I think we have to probably frame it properly, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, good. Guys, so we're going to stop the recording for the people who are following online and keep this part for this. We have these meetings every week, and we always keep a part of it for just ourselves. So Jonathan also gets to talk off camera for once and say what he really thinks.
Yeah.
And doesn't have
to,
to
watch my words. Like the whole time I was like watching my words. I'm like, okay, well, don't use that word. Don't use that word.